What's happening, everybody? It's Sean with reactions to the classics. Today we got another Marillion reaction. This time their album Holidays in Eden, brought to us by a friend, longtime supporter, and Marillion superfan Joseph, otherwise known as Actor JSB around these parts. Thank you, Joseph. Appreciate you. Appreciate all the patrons who make this thing go. If you'd like to support us in any way, check out that Patreon link below or the Patreon link on the end screen. Done a lot of Marillion. Did Season's End a couple months ago. You can go check that out after this. We got a lot of other Marillion up as well. Thanks to Joseph. We got a lot of super fans in the community of different artists, but I can't imagine there's any super fan that knows much more about any artist than Joseph knows about Marillion. So I always enjoy it. I quite enjoy Marillion myself. So Joseph has all of the research on this. He knows way more about this than me. I didn't have to do my normal job of research. So I'm going to share Joseph's thoughts. He says, we continue our travels through the early years of the H era with what managed to become the band's second, quote, difficult second album. The first being, of course, their actual second album, 1984's Fugazi, and probably the most controversial album of their career, at least within the established fan base at the time. For this prog band, or are they, went full on pop, or did they? Well, we're going to find out. You'd be forgiven for thinking that after H had entered the band so seamlessly during the making of Season's End and following a lengthy and supremely successful tour where their new singer was welcomed into the fold by the fans night after night, that it would be smooth sailing heading into album number 2. But Marillion just don't do easy. What perhaps neither party had fully realized during the making of the previous album was that the vast majority of the music had been written over a long period of months before H even entered the picture, so it all seemed to come together very quickly once he arrived. This time they were starting from scratch, and even for a band with a generally intermittently slow writing speed, inspiration wasn't quick to flow. Having booked themselves in a plush residential studio, Stanbridge Farm, with the intention of having a new album written within a month or two, they would finally emerge 6 months later with almost an album's worth of material written. At some point in this process, it also became apparent that EMI, in the vain hope of repeating the fluke success of Kaylee, were looking for an album containing 3 hit singles. Not asking for much, right? As Pete related, they were thinking, well, what are we doing with this band? And more to the point, what's this band doing for us? If we didn't have another big hit soon, the writing would be on the wall. Mark Kelly adds, we were prepared to give it a go. The biggest problem was that we weren't very good at writing hit singles. That's not a bad thing, right? Or for a time, complete songs at all. Frustrated by the lack of progress, H was constantly making suggestions on how to turn what material they had into actual finished songs. Looking back on this time, H now says, quote, I kept trying to finish songs whilst everyone else became increasingly nervous. I really hadn't realized how the band wrote. They like to jam and then forget about it, leave it on the shelf like a good wine and then come back to taste it in a year to see how it's aging. I was trying to get things finished off because that was how it always worked. Understandably, that made everybody uneasy. Eventually, the two opposing approaches proved too much, and it was suggested that H take a break. As H relays, they did say, it might be better if you went home for a couple weeks and just let us go at our own pace. Part of me thought, wow, they're sending me home. Part of me thought, 2 weeks off. Returning a fortnight later with a demo of The Party in hand, he noted that nothing seemed to have changed in his absence. He laughs now that, quote, they might have agreed on as much as a chord change. EMI were getting nervous at the lack of progress and sent the band's A&R man, Nick Gatfield, to intervene. Gatfield was a former saxophonist with Dexy's Midnight Runners and was well liked by the band, who were nonetheless nervous at the thought of him interfering with their creative process. His presence did at least have him pick out No One Can as a track that had hit potential the label were looking for. But as Steve Rothery states, it was the only time in our career where we felt a certain amount of commercial pressure from a record company. We've always followed our own path. We were pushed in a certain direction, which is a little bit unnatural and at times unsatisfying. Nevertheless, by 1990, they had enough material to decamp the Moles Club in Bath to record demos and play a few low-key gigs where they debuted several of the newly written tracks to what has been described as a, quote, reassuring response. The next stumbling block was to find a suitable producer after Season's End collaborator Nick Davis proved unavailable. They next turned to Chris Kimsey, producer of the Misplaced Childhood and Clutching at Straws albums. I have a reaction to that if that album's fantastic. Who was keen but couldn't confirm a start date due to ongoing work on the Rolling Stones' live Flashpoint album. Eventually, as Mark explains, he had to call him and say, Chris, either blank or get off the pot. He said, I'll get off the pot. Eventually, the job went to another Chris, Christopher Neal, a producer most known for working with pop acts, but whose success with Mike and the Mechanics made him EMI's clear favorite for working with the band. As H recalls, quote, I think the label thought, which prog rockers have had pop hits? Oh, Mike Rutherford. If we could do a Mike and the Mechanics with Marillion, we'll have hits and get on the radio and make a lot of money. It was only that simple, right? Aware of their doubts, and not without some reservations of his own, Neil told him that they were his son's favorite band, and if he effed it up, his son would never forgive him. H says now, I'm not sure if it was true or not, but that was a line that got him the gig, really. Having been briefed by Nick Gatfield to make the songs as accessible to radio as possible, Neil's response was that he would do that for the 3 singles the labels were craving, but the rest, quote, had to be Marillion. While everybody enjoyed working with him, the speed at which he worked was a bugbear to some. In the liner notes for the 1998 remaster, Mark Kelly noted that he, quote, got pissed off with the speed of recording. 7 weeks might be a long time for the Spice Girls to record an album, but it's nowhere near long enough for us. His criticism has eased over the years, but he still feels dissatisfied with his parts. But he has noted how different producers favor different instruments, with Nick Tauber being quite keyboard-oriented, so he was indulged in the early years. Then Chris Kimsey gravitating to the guitars. He said, but with Chris Neil, it was all about the vocals and vocal melodies, which is fine. I just feel like I didn't get a fair chance just to experiment and try things, really. It was a case of Chris saying, well, just play what you did on the demo. That was fine. That works. We don't need anything else. So it felt a bit rushed. He was used to making an album in 8 weeks, but we weren't. Okay, Joseph says, on at last to the track by track. It's a quotes pulled from a wide variety of sources, but the documentary and last year's deluxe edition provide the bulk of them. If you've never been with us before, the music will not be in the video, but it will be at a Vimeo link below, so click on that and follow along with us. We'll start out with the album opener, Splintering Heart. Joseph says, H recalled in the notes for the 1998 remaster that, quote, the lyric came to me in a flash in early of 1990. I went for a walk in Toronto. I was on my way to the CN Tower doing the tourist thing. I wrote it down with a felt pen on a photo wallet. It was the only piece of paper available. I was feeling lonely and I could sometimes feel it pricking at me. It's an icy place in February, Toronto, and I was imagining a heart shattering from its own hardness or coldness. Musically, he says, that came together quickly, then later on became unrecognizable. As Pete explains, one of the big things Chris did with Splintering Heart was change the beginning. The original demo had kind of a wailing guitar, with almost like a banshee kind of guitar thing going on. As Mark elaborates in his memoir, quote, this wasn't to Chris's taste. He wanted something that was less grunge and more synth pop. Chris Neil himself says, quote, I remember Splintering Heart was quite a move away from what they'd normally done. It was early days of programming and MIDI and stuff, and then the band came flying in halfway through because normally they wouldn't go that long with electronics. But for Splintering Heart, it worked for the piece. It worked really well. Mark agrees. He said, quote, I think it's a good opener for the album because it's got that slow build. It's a great opener for live shows, too, as we've discovered. I don't think we planned it. Speaking of it being played live, H says, quote, whenever I hear Splintering Heart, I just think of the cake. Standing in Philadelphia in my long black coat, waiting to go on, counting the kick drum so I can walk on and sing. Someone came up to me and said, look, we've got you a cake. And I'm going, well, that's lovely, but I'm about to go on stage. I've never forgotten it. Every time we do Splintering Heart, I think of, ta-da, we got you this. Yeah, that is a weird thing. All right, I'm going to have the lyrics up as always. Thanks again, Joseph. Splintering Heart, I was really looking forward to listening to that after that write-up, kind of seeing how it's different. It was 2 minutes, 40 seconds before the guitar even came in. So, yeah, a very slow building and different kind of pace song from what I know from Marillion. So I could see how people would be going, what is going on here? But I thought it was well done. I mean, H's vocals on here, you kind of feel him. You feel the emotive vocals in here, a little bit of pain in there. So good way to start this out. Except we have Cover My Eyes in parentheses, Pain in Heaven. Joseph says, even as they were preparing to record, the infamous 3 singles EMI had requested were still not obvious, with the exception of No One Can. And it was Chris Neil who made the breakthrough. As H explained in the liner notes for the 1992 Best of, quote, we just given Chris a cassette of unfinished half ideas along with songs that were already complete, and he phoned one night to say if we were to arrange 2 of the ideas together, we would have another single. As he elaborated in 2022, one day Chris kicked down the door and said, there's a hit here. You put this with this and then do this. We said, are you sure? And he said, oh, yes. And so we did. Chris Neil recollects, quote, I think in my mind, Nick Gatfield was perched on my shoulder like some angel or demon saying, get them on top of the pops, get them on Radio 1. And I think what I did was just tweak the arrangement here and there to make it what the Americans call an ear cookie or an earworm, like the chanting and the big anthemic stuff. It's a balancing act because you don't really want to sell them down the river with a brand like Marillion. It can't be too poppy, but that was as poppy as I dared go with them, and as poppy as they'd let me go. In the end, the song did get the band on Top of the Pops, released a few weeks ahead of the album. It debuted at number 42 with the subsequent Top of the Pops appearance, giving it a bit of a boost to spend the following 2 weeks at number 34, but before dropping away again. There was a much bigger hit in the Netherlands. Cover My Eyes, Pain and Heaven, that whole, I don't know what I think of this song, right? It's different. I think I like it. I do. I think I like it, man. Definitely different, but well done, and not overly poppy. I mean, let's not get, but I know for them. But I think I make notes on all these songs. I got honorable mention, maybe, question mark. We'll see how this album plays out. Let's go on to the third track. And who doesn't like a good one of these, right? The Party. Joseph says, while Mark describes his track as, quote, the most naive sounding song on the album, Pete feels this is an example of a track from the album that is quite classically Marillion, though Steve Hogarth has quite a big hand in writing that. H says, I was trying to capture the atmosphere of the first teenage parties I went to up in Yorkshire. I was young and naive, and everything about them seemed mystically illicit and dangerous. I remember those days, and those were days that were a long time ago. The man in the off license used to let me buy a bottle of cider, even though I was only 16 and only looked 14. These are my first forays into the wild world of alcohol, girls, dark rooms, joss sticks, patchouli oil, and Led Zeppelin. Some of that I don't even know what it is. A good example of what Chris Neal refers to as H's little one-act plays. The gender flipping of the protagonist is presumably partly to edge back slightly from the autobiographical nature of the song, but also to add a slightly darker element to the tale. All right, The Party. Really well done because it gets through all the vocals a little over halfway through, and then that Steve Rothery is able to come in and run. And I mean, Mark sounds great on the keyboard, so able to run that up a little bit that he comes in at the very end. And it was interesting changing it to a girl instead of a guy, and kind of when she goes in the back room, the music changes. So I like that too. They built the atmosphere of the song nicely. But went to a few parties when I was younger. I actually didn't go to a lot of parties because I was an athlete and I took that very seriously. So I didn't go to a lot of parties, but I did go to some, and it was crazy to see how people acted. So I could put myself in this picture. Next up, we have No One Can. Joseph says, writing in the 1998 remaster, H said, quote, I had written these words standing in a field near to the rehearsal studio in Brighton one day. I've been away from home for most of the 18 months since I joined the band, and I was beginning to feel alienated from my wife and daughter. It was a beautiful day, and I had a head full of the natural things all around me and the sense of separation from the people I love most. I imagine it's worse for them than it is for me, and these words are an attempt to say, it's okay, you're with me here, and to argue against the myth that to be single is to be free. I remember being single. I don't remember it being great. So that's a great bunch of stuff right there. More recently, he's highlighted the line, there's something of you in everything that I love is his favorite. Quote, because I was thinking about my children and our shared memories, all of that. I think if you do love someone, then there is something of them in everything else. It isn't there because that's the prism you start to live through. Yeah, your view of life, right? You share so much, and then if you have children, then they became the physical embodiment of you and that other person. This was the one everyone felt had the most potential to cross over into the pop charts, and it started well. Unfortunately, that meant EMI dropped their promotional ball early on, shifting their promotional efforts to a new Vanilla Ice single, which bombed, by the way, but I didn't need to tell you that. That was just to me, but I'm going to tell you guys that. So despite one of the promo teams saying he'd jump out the window if it wasn't a huge hit, it only ended up beating Cover My Eyes by 1 place, peaking at number 33. Although they'd give it a second chance when re-released in 1992, or did slightly better, creeping up to the dizzying heights of number 26. Disappointment at the time has merged with hindsight now, as Mark notes, if that had become a hit, we'd have done a second album with Chris Neal and probably never made Brave. We'll get to that another month, though we are getting to that, Joseph tells us. While H expresses similar feelings, quote, even now if I put No One Can on, it sounds like a hit. It sounds like something that was huge in the 80s. He bursts out laughing. I think had it been a hit, we'd all live in bigger houses, but I don't think we'd be happy. That's wisdom. H got a lot of wisdom, man, I'm telling you. Whether or not we'd still be together, I really don't know. I think it would have put us all in a pressure cooker. It would have pushed me more to the front as a pop star, which would have gone to my head and maybe an unpleasant person possibly. The guy is so self-aware and wise, reminds me so much of myself. Yeah, after all the build up to this song, everything that we learned before it started, I agree with all. I'm really surprised this wasn't a bigger song, and it definitely, like H said, sounded like it should have been a song. It was a hit in the '80s and very well written, and the personal nature of it, is fantastic. Talking about it, how in his single days it wasn't that great. Used to just go out and party and boast and stuff he didn't even really believe. And now he's got her. It doesn't matter that he's always with her. The chorus, I like, no one can take you away from me now. Don't worry if they take me away. No one can take you away from me now. Don't matter how long we have to wait. Like, you're here, I'm with you. So, yeah, well done. Next up, you see it below the title track, Holidays in Eden. Joseph says this is a track the band had been working on when H was sent home for his rest, and is also the only track in the album to feature a John Helmer lyric, though he did also contribute one of the B-sides. H says it came from a lyric that John had written about going away on holiday and losing yourself to the point where you even change your name and your identity completely goes, and I can relate to that as well, having toured a lot. I found there's a point in the season's end tour where I was no longer me. I was this other thing, and then you've got to come home and go back to being the person you used to be, and it isn't easy. I can only imagine, right? Can you really think about touring around, the craziness of it, being on stage, everybody cheering, now you just go back to this normal life? It would be weird. The band themselves have never been particularly enamored of the track. Mark noting, quote, I think we were trying to be Yes or something on that one. I think it's one of those ones that's more fun to play than to listen to. I've sort of got that feeling. Ian adds that it's one of those tracks that sounded a lot better live with much greater energy to it. While Pete just says, Holidays is one of those songs I feel should have been better than it was. I don't know why. While it isn't a band favorite, Chris Neal was a fan, saying, quote, it didn't seem typical of all the others, but I love the way this section segued into each other, and I love the way it ended, and the arrangement they put together was excellent. All right, Holidays in Eden. I liked it when it started. I don't know what I think of this song. I don't know that I like it all that much. I think because he said, he hears Yes in it. I hear Yes in it. And I respect Yes for being a great band. We got one of their albums up there that was fantastic. But I'm not a huge Yes fan or a huge fan of that sound as a rule. So, like, the lyrics are good. The lyrics are really good. Just kind of delving out how you go somewhere and then you come back home and you're not the same person. But really, those people don't want anything to do with you either. You kind of don't belong anywhere. But I don't know if that was an organ or just the keys there in the middle. That part I wasn't feeling, and maybe that kind of threw me off. But I mean, it's not a bad song. I can see how it would be good live. All right, next up we have Dry Land. Another example, Joseph says, of the band not really having an obvious single ready to go. In this case, solved by Chris Neal hearing the title track of How We Live's sole album and convincing the band to remake it. As Mark puts it, if you're going to do a cover version, you might as well do one that at least someone in the band has written. It's not really a cover version in that sense. While H says Chris heard it and wanted it very much to go on the record, and nobody could think of a good reason not to. It felt a bit awkward. It felt a bit weird. Certainly not something I would have pushed for myself. The good thing about it, it was probably the best song Colin and I had written together, and it was going to see the light of day in a way it otherwise never would have. Steve Rothery found it, quote, unusual having to learn someone else's guitar parts for the verse and chorus, but it's a great song. I didn't mind doing it, and I wrote a solo for it that was nothing to do with the original. It's probably one of the solos I'm most proud of on that album. Designated as the third single, Mark describes EMI's decision to press ahead with its release, following the underwhelming performance of No One Can as being, quote, like a dog going after a rabbit into a thicket. It reached the familiar peak of number 34, but fell to the charts even faster than the other two singles had, at which point Mark recalls the band having even a collective sigh of relief or despair. He doesn't actually say. They're probably just glad that 3 singles and probably knew that from now on EMI would not be pushing for those 3 singles. Dry Land, he's pursuing this girl who he hasn't been with yet, but thinks she'd be open to it, and that's kind of the idea of the song. I'll tell you, that song grew on me because about halfway through, I'm like, this is probably going to be a thumbs down for me, but H is such a great vocalist that it's hard for him to sing a bad song where I don't like it. And then I thought Steve Rothery's solo in there really brought it up as well. So it shifted me on this one. Next up, we have Waiting to Happen. Steve Rothery calls this track one of my favorite tracks on the album. It's a beautiful love song. One of those things where all those elements came together and created something so strong from the sum of the 5 of us. That's kind of what I've wanted for the whole album, given the choice. Another lyrically straightforward offering. H notes its origins as, quote, I remember lying in bed and one night, unable to sleep, listening to it raining, listening to my wife breathing next to me asleep. It just came from that memory. All right, Waiting to Happen. I mean, Joseph does such a good job of pulling these quotes that you know what the song's about. I don't really have to explain the song to you on these. I mean, it's just a great love song, man. And H sounds fantastic. Just really, really well done. He has such power in his voice. He just makes these songs come alive. We have 3 songs left, but we're going to play them all in a row because it's a This Town trilogy. 3 tracks to be played back to back. This Town, The Rake's Progress, which is less than 2 minutes long, and 100 Nights. In the 1998 remaster, H says, I'd written these words about the threat imposed upon a relationship by 2 people moving from where they grew up and met to a city. The feeling that the city is seducing your lover away from you and being jealous of it and knowing it will win. Speaking in 2022, he said, I'd grown up provincial in Doncaster. I'd moved down to the smoke with my girlfriend, and it didn't corrupt us and it didn't tear us apart. But I used to think that it might. And so it's a work of fiction about 2 people living together in a big city and being torn apart by the city, by what the city does to them. And if you've had to become this other person to work in the city, which I think does happen to people, they have to dress up in their business suits and go to work and pretend to be this thing. And then I'd imagine what if that person had become heartbroken by this and uses a shell that has grown around them to become an utter bastard. And then he's ideally suited to the city himself, then he became part of it. So he becomes a product of it. And I guess he becomes a gigolo, doesn't he? And the idea of passing another man on the staircase and knowing that you're sleeping with his wife and having seen his clothes in her wardrobe, pretty spooky, pretty nasty. So it sort of took on that twist, this sort of descent into the moral vacuum. Chris Neal simply says, I think it was the band's wish to have those more Marillion epic moments towards the end. So you're left feeling so that having heard some of the more commercial pieces, you were still left feeling like you'd listened to a Marillion set, which I think was smart. All right, I'm looking forward to this one. All 3 back to back to back, not stopping it. Let's go. All right, This Town trilogy. I mean, it starts out with This Town. We get the sirens, the sounds of the city, but very rocking. The Rake's Progress is this little segue, not a lot, it's not very long, and there's not a lot of lyrics. And then go to 100 Nights, which is just classic Marillion to me. This was fantastic. Tells the story that H had already described, right? Where he's leaving, the guy passes him in the stairway, why spending your money? But she's basically with me, so how's that feel? But that was fantastic. I super, super enjoyed that one. So my favorite tracks on here are going to be honorable mention Splintering Heart, Cover My Eyes, even though it's poppy, right? It's still waiting to happen. My faves are going to be No One Can and This Town trilogy. I mean, we'll call it one song, but yeah, it's just fantastic. Before I get to my overall score, we'll get Joseph's final thoughts and aftermath, as he calls it. He said, so EMI and the band didn't exactly manage the mass success that they dreamt of with those 3 hit singles. Though it's interesting to note that they have by far the most streams on Spotify, which is not the case for most other H-era singles. I noticed that same thing. But the album itself was still a moderate success, matching Season's Ends by peaking at number 7, their last single-digit peak position for 25 years, as it turned out. And while it lost them a few fans, it also gained them some new ones. It also did especially well in Germany, staying in the listings there for 21 weeks. As H noted in his diaries upon receiving news it had been in the German top 30 for 8 weeks, hardly Dark Side of the Moon, but I was surprised. In the 1998 remaster, in connection to this being labeled their pop album, H noted, "A splintering heart in the party are pop songs. I'll eat my pink Telecaster," while more recently he'd said, "What I love about Holidays in Eden is that it sounded like a proper polished album to me. I'd waited all my life to be involved in something proper and polished." And even Mark, usually the band's most self-critical member, calls it a well-balanced album. Pete and Steve Rothery still deem it somewhat Marillion light, though the 2022 remix, which has been given a beefier sound, has improved it to their ears, which are of course sticking with the original mix. And the songs have endured for a band with such a vast catalog. It's notable that almost all of these tracks have continued to be shuffled in and out of set lists to this day. Most recently, The Party, No One Can, and Dry Land were all given an airing at night one of the Marillion weekends this year and always receive a great response. Joseph says, for myself, and bearing in mind that this one sits bang in the middle of my favorite 5-album run in history, part of me can recognize, objectively at least, that this is the weakest album in that run. But most of me simply doesn't care because he loves it. And I love that. Obviously, he knows this way better than I do. He's listened to it a bazillion times, I'm sure. For me, I don't like as much as Season's End. I don't like as much as any Marillion album I've heard, although that's not a bad thing. I'm still going to be at a 7.5 on this. This Town trilogy really saved it from possibly dipping into those 6s. I don't know. I don't know that it would have got there because H is, I mean, H is such a great vocalist, and Rothery on, well, really all the guys, but, the musicianship is fantastic. So let me know what you think of this album down below. Go check out our other Marillion stuff, and don't worry, more Marillion's coming up soon. Thanks again to Joseph. Thanks to you for watching. Until next time, guys, I will see you.